Hello. Today we have with us Dr. Ed Rintoul, who is a consultant anesthetist and one of my colleagues who has recently been appointed into this post and will talk to us today about his interview experience. Hello, Ed, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great. We'll start off with a bit of what happened before, just your life and journey before you before you got invited to come to the interview. So in your last year, I know that you acted up as a consultant. When did you start to think about this process of having to sit in front of an interview panel and the prospect of answering questions to get a job? Did this thought occur to you sort of in the last year of your training, or when was the first time you ever thought of it?
I think my first, not necessarily interview per se, but where I was going to end up and talking to the right people started when I was in Cambridge in my ST5 year, where I thought I was likely going to be applying to there. And then I came to Stevenage and I really enjoyed there and had to backtrack slightly on my statements that I'd made earlier on joining the trust. And I think it was at the point that you're talking to the clinical directors in hospitals where you think you may want to apply to a consultant position. That's the first step in my mind that I was taking towards my interview preparation. So I knew those people were going to be integral to applications going forward, making sure that they knew that you were interested in posts that were going to be coming out. And then it was at that point that you were kind of gauging both job availability and where those next steps were going to go.
Did you actually think about the fact that you would have to prepare for the interview, or did that come much later on after you'd actually applied and got shortlisted?
That came later. It's the actual, I think, short-sightedly, it was thinking about it in terms of hurdles and not thinking about the next hurdle until you've already gone over the first one. So I thought, right, apply for the job, get shortlisted. And then it was at that point really that I started thinking about the interview.
So then when you get shortlisted, there's basically two things to go through, isn't it? There's one, the preparation for the interview itself, which is a process. And then there is the other thing about meeting the panel members.
Yes.
So let's talk first about meeting the panel members. So you got emailed a number of people to meet. Did you meet them all?
I did. I emailed everyone. I didn't meet them all. There was one surprise on the day, which was the director of people attended who hadn't been on the list initially of people to reach out to for the pre-interview visits. And the non-exec member of the board sent out a very nice reply, which was that he preferred to meet people for the first time in the interview panel, but thanked me for the email. Everyone else, we arranged a time and a place to meet, which happened to be at work for each of them. They gave the options of either Teams or in person. I took the in-person approach for each of them and thought you were able to always give a better impression face to face than you are on a Teams meeting. And then geography limits some things. And they were useful and they were informal. They still turned up looking smart, but it's they went relatively smoothly.
So I was going to ask you, in terms of usefulness, what did you find useful in them? Do you think they gave you a clue to what questions they might ask? Or they say it's the candidate's chance to ask questions when you're doing the pre-interview meeting. So did you go armed with a set of questions, or did you have something in your mind about what you were going to ask them? And what did they tell you that you thought, looking back now after the interview, that actually helped you during the interview?
I think I was in by no means a unique position of having already been working in the trust for a year at the point of having these meetings. So it was not as much this is what the trust does, but a little bit more of a chance to not be an unknown entity to them when I came into the interview, and for them not to be a stranger asking questions. The actual information that they gave was fairly feel generic in terms of the conversation they had. It was more small talk and putting at ease rather than any new information. But I think it was a chance at least to almost pre-sell myself a little bit. And so kind of the medical director, I talked about some of the research I had done and he seemed interested, and I sent him across my editorial that I had published recently, and that was useful. It was one less thing I needed to necessarily bring up in an interview or kind of shoehorn in at any point, that I had already got those points across and had potentially been in his mind.
And I can tell you now that he did read that, because he told me after your interview that he'd read the article you wrote.
So it was helpful.
So none of them actually gave you anything concrete in terms of, there are sometimes people say, this is what I'm going to ask you specifically. So I remember my own interview many years ago. Ned had told me that they're going to ask me something specific and said, I usually ask candidates this question. So there was none of that in yours, was there?
No, they said the medical director said that there would be something potentially related to either audit processes, or he said you wouldn't be surprised by any of the questions, that he's not going to come out with a curveball. And there are a list of standard questions that get asked that are widely available. And he asked about a mistake and what I had learned from it, which was not an unexpected question, and one that I'd prepared for. A newly appointed radiologist who was on the panel had, when I now look back, given me signs as to what she was going to ask. But I think I hadn't quite picked up on that. We had a fairly broad ranging conversation, and a lot of it was, having been newly through the process herself, she was giving me tips and advice on what she had been through.
Okay.
And
So
for yourself,
yeah.
you didn't tell me exactly what you were going to ask, but you didn't leave it. It wasn't I wasn't asked any curveballs in there.
Yeah, I probably didn't know what I was going to ask you when we talked about the interview. Okay, so just moving on to the interview day itself. So we had, from what I remember, we didn't ask you to make a presentation. You came in and then talk us through the questions now. The first question was from the college rep, who was a consultant vascular anaesthetist from somewhere in Wales, and they were the college reps. And if I remember, they asked you to describe how you were suitable for this role. Is that correct?
They asked how I was suitable, and in particular my experience for the of my ST7 year, and how my SIAs that I had chosen aided my application and suitability for the role. So it wasn't quite a why are you suitable or talk me through your CV broad. It was a little bit more narrowed to my final year, but my prepared answer that I had a relative structure for, of tell me about yourself or talk me through your CV, I narrowed that down more or less to speaking about my interests, which were vascular and perioperative medicine and major general surgery. And so all of those linked into an answer that I already had in my mind.
Then he threw a slight curveball.
He did. He asked about how you would assess someone's competence, and he gave two examples of a trainee who you were working with and a surgeon who you were working with, and how you would assess their competence. Felt the anesthetic training was a bit easier. You would be thinking about both their clinical and their non-clinical skills. You have a role in mentoring and educating and training as a consultant. So that answer seemed to flow a little bit more easily, and you can talk about talking to their educational supervisor and routes of escalation if they're failing to meet those standards, having conversations with the trainee themselves. The surgeon really threw me for a while, and I think I floundered initially in the question, and then went back to good medical practice and kind of went as competence as per how the GMC describes good medical practice. So they're not talking about their clinical skills necessarily, citing the fact that I didn't necessarily have the point to judge them on, but answered the question in terms of good medical practice and comparing them to those standards and the non-clinical skills that go along with that.
Question number one, sorry, questionnaire number one and question number three, you get a bit of a curveball. So what are you thinking at this stage? Sat there, you are obviously a little bit stumped, because it's not a usual question that get asked. How do you assess the competency of a surgeon that you're working with? So what thoughts went through your head? Did you just fall back on the basics, or what do you think would have, looking back now, would anything have helped make it different?
I think without knowing that specific question, it's a little bit like Vivas. You take a second and have a drink, try to compose yourself before jumping into an answer. And then there was a lot of thinking as I was talking, and you never quite know how that comes across initially. And I think on reflection, you would take a little bit more time and I don't see that as necessarily being detrimental to your impression to be considered in an answer, as long as you're not making it into a prolonged awkward silence, because there was definitely talking about the anaesthetist, which I was fairly happy using that time to formulate an answer for how I'd then talk about the surgeon. And it was only as I was answering it that I really fell into the answer of good medical practice, based my answer around there. So I think taking a little bit more time and not feeling rushed to give an incomplete answer would be my advice to my past self.
You thought about that question since then, or you don't
I
bother? I
have. It's
mean,
like, I
you
spent
might not.
every now and again you kind of think it's like, would I have answered it any differently? And I think for that one, probably not. And I don't think even if I had prepared for another 2 months, I'm not sure that I would have gone through that particular question. I think the preparation I did put me in a happier place because I came through with the first question feeling like it was under my belt. It was almost a give me a talk about yourself. It let me flow
Yeah.
into, let you start flowing and in the way that you've prepared. And so if I'd been stumped by the first question and then come up against a curveball, I think that definitely could have thrown your confidence, thrown you off your flow. But the fact that you have a relatively easy initial question definitely helps in that way.
Well, so let's move on to the second question. And the second question was by the intervention radiologist on the panel who asked you about a service development project. Do you remember the question?
She asked, in my mind, she asked how I would help as an anaesthetist in the service development of a uterine embolization for fibroids. I think subsequently on
Yeah, and I think
conversation with
there was
yourself.
a bit of there was a bit of specific question around the post-op pain management of those patients. But yeah, I mean, even the other bit that you said, answering that would probably also be fine. What were your thoughts on, or what are your thoughts now? And what did you think back then? I guess back then you kind of knew you'd get asked that question, isn't it? Because she
I
told
knew,
you in the
yes,
pre-interview meeting.
she
Yeah.
told me in the pre-interview meeting, we talked about a few different things. We spent a lot of time talking about cryotherapy, and I kind of had in my mind something about that. I hadn't thought that she was maybe going to ask something a little bit more clinical related rather than a new service development. And I definitely felt thrown off by that question because I was like, I've never set up a service. I have no idea really about the processes which go into setting up a new service within a hospital. I know the anesthetic related bits of it, but I, at the time, couldn't put those things together in my head. And so I definitely floundered at that point. I talked broadly, I think, about the anesthetic side of how patients can be managed for that type of surgery or that type of intervention. Again, not really hitting the question. I knew I wasn't hitting the question, but couldn't really think about how to then structure an answer from there. I then fell back onto the preparation that I'd done, thinking of the way that Eastern North Heart's set up in a triumvirate structure, and made sure to talk about including the medical, nursing, and operational side of any new service, and making sure you're kind of addressing that triumvirate structure that they had. And I felt that I was trying to dig myself out of a hole. I never felt particularly comfortable in the question. And I know
Do
on
you think that
feedback
was a
since,
harsh question?
I don't think it was a harsh question. I think that highlighted a lack of preparation on my side rather than a harsh question. And definitely there was a lot of stress that goes into it because you want to get the job. So you're there because you're teeing up and putting a lot of eggs in a basket of wanting that to be your future career. So I think the stress that I think mentally I had going on wasn't managed particularly well at that point. So I just didn't listen. And if I could have asked her to ask the question again. If I had, just to make sure that I'd misheard, I could have just clarified even halfway through, but I didn't. I tried to kind of steamroll into an answer, and then you end up having answered something, and either you have to stop, backtrack, and say, "Oh, ignore all of that," which doesn't give a great impression, or you try and talk on through and see if you can dig yourself out of that hole.
Well, I would say that that's probably not an unreasonable thing to do, because if you realize that you mumbled through most of whatever you said so far, and said, you know what, scrap all of that. I'm going to start again. This is what I'm going to do. I think that'll be fine. I mean, just
for the
for
future.
others who will listen to it, I personally think that'll be fine as long as what came out next came out as vaguely sensible. So with the now knowing that you know what you know, having been in the role for a few months, would you have answered that differently, or would you have answered it better, you think?
I think I'd have answered it better, only because if I sat in the same chair again, I wouldn't have the nerves that went along with that. And I think I could have, you give yourself a little, every time a question came up that I had a prepared answer for, the bandwidth that you had to process all of that and your answer and how you're gesticulating, how you're talking, how you're presenting yourself, I think was much greater. As soon as there was one that required that little bit more thinking, I think that's when the mumbling and the slightly off kilter answers came about. So I think from a fact that I wouldn't have the stress or as much stress kind of alongside it, and B, because I think I could have structured that answer a lot better. I still don't, I've still not implemented a service. I still don't know how all of that goes, but I would have talked about more of the people that I would have spoken to and the processes that I would have gone through as a clinician to discuss with the people who would help to set up a service and be able to talk about those things. So I think it's the experience of being in the job has definitely helped, but more necessarily to give you confidence in knowing kind of actually how things happen. It's never one person on their own. You're always involving other people within a trust to do anything bigger than giving it anesthetic. It's I think that's probably how I'd go about answering it.
Cool. Let's move on to the next question. Then you got asked, I think, by one of my colleagues, the impact of was it impact of positive feedback?
As impact of positive feedback, giving a personal example of having received good feedback, how that made me feel, and how you would share that sort of learning across a department. And again, it
Which again
wasn't.
was a bit of something that would throw you off because most people prepare for or would prepare for what, how would you react if you get negative feedback, wouldn't you?
Yes. So kind of you prepare for what's your biggest flaw, negative feedback, criticism, kind of stuff going wrong. Those are all the ones that you prepare for. So the good feedback threw me a little bit, and I took an experience or combined two experiences that I'd had and made them into a single story that fit the scenario that I was giving. So that gave me something to talk about from personal experience and said that it made you feel good because, sure, that's what you're expecting to be saying. And then how you then shared that. Again, it was actually remember what I said now, the answer. I think it was something along the lines of sharing it in both a direct way to whoever's received the feedback, as well as the sharing it at the monthly half day rotas, half day meetings,
Audit meetings. Yeah.
audit meetings, and making sure that good work is celebrated as much as something that's gone wrong is investigated and learnt from. Good work is then learnt from and built upon, and the people who are doing that are celebrated in the same way. So that was where I went with
So
that
far,
answer.
then three people have asked questions and only one has sort of been something that you've really prepared for.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So then the next question which I asked was about reflecting on yourself.
It was. It was not phrased in necessarily as simple a way as that, and took a little bit of unpicking, having already had a few curveballs. It was along the lines of thinking of something either positive or negative that has changed over the last 12 months, having been at Lister for those 12 months, and whether that's changed for either the positive or the negative, and how I reflect on that going forward. So it had a lot of scope in there to be able to talk about more or less anything that I chose. But again, it comes back to the same one about the competence or the service development question. It was if I'd taken maybe a little bit more time, composed an answer, and then answered rather than pushing ahead sooner than necessarily an answer was ready. I think those extra 30 seconds wouldn't have meant anything to the panel. It wouldn't have developed into an awkward silence. But I think you feel that time rushes past you in those stressful situations, and that you're feeling like you've sat there thinking about it for a long time, when in reality it's not. And yeah,
Yeah, it's
advice
not that long.
advice to my past self would again just take a moment and think about it for an extra 30 seconds.
So then your next three questions were kind of the ones you would have prepped for, which were the medical director question, which was, have you made a mistake? Or tell us about
Tell us
something
about a
that's gone
mistake
wrong.
you've made, or it was phrased in a way of something in your anesthetic career, kind of a mistake. And at that point, not a joke necessarily, but something as like, oh well, like, 'cause when I was doing some preparation, I was going through the different mistakes that had happened, and he made a quip about, no, I only want you to tell me about one. Please don't tell me about anything that will make you unappointable. And they got a whole laugh from the panel, which I think put everything at ease a little bit. And that one again was one that I'd prepared for, so that rolled off quite easily.
So previously I've talked about how bad can you go with the mistake that you've made? Would you talk about something like a wrong-sided block? So do you mind telling us what mistake you talked about?
Yeah, so I thought about this a lot, and I thought about just going up with a completely fabricated event, thinking of something like, I know, giving paracetamol 3.5 hours after it was given instead of 4 hours because you've misread a drug chart. And it was in my head, it was coming up with something that was both not unappointable, but not just a kind of bystander to an event. You didn't want to give something that was just a small, I know, I picked up on Danstron and I put it in a dexamethasone syringe and gave it. It's like, and no one,
Yeah.
you want something that's juicy enough to engage a panel, and that's something that had enough of an impact that made you change your behavior, and then how you could then talk about that reflection on your change of behavior. So I went with, when I had first started in the new trust, I think wanted to make a good impression on the consultant who I was with, who happened to be my educational supervisor. Said I was happy with the equipment. Patient had laryngospasm, and then I couldn't ventilate because I was unfamiliar with the machine, and I thought I'd switched it on to manual mode. I thought I'd switched it up to 100%, but with the Draeger machines, you needed to double press the big orange button to actually make it do what you want it to do, resulting in a desaturation of the patient and having to pull the emergency buzzer on the first day, which is always a great experience. Patient with, the things that made me choose it was showed some reflection upon myself and a degree of awareness of what led to those mistakes. The fact that the patient didn't come to any harm and that they were well, I could then showcase kind of duty of candor and talking to the patient afterwards. I then, I think more importantly, could demonstrate that as a result of that, I then became a trainee rep at the hospital. I then made sure that the induction phase of all the new starters, which happened every 3 months, had a proper machine induction, and really labored that point that the equipment kind of machine induction needed to be well taught, because you get left solo for relatively quickly. And so choosing that scenario made it could tick quite a few boxes along the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, so in terms of what mistake to talk about, it should be, from what I gather you're saying, and I kind of agree with what you're saying, it should be juicy and credible enough that people believe it, and actually at
But
least
not
the in
well,
the room. Well, not unappointable, yes, obviously not that. But also the anesthetist in the room would identify with that kind of a mistake. And then, as you said, the two or three other things that follow through after a mistake. What actions, what reflection did you do? What actions you took afterwards to rectify not just that mistake, but other things that the same thing can affect other people. So you demonstrated that. And then finally followed by duty of candor, which I think you cover a lot of points by. I think these are the big headings to, I think about when telling a panel about mistakes. And I also wrote down here that it's a good time to tell the panel a story and just get everybody engaged with that. So then the issue of mistakes didn't end there. You got asked next something else about a mistake. Was it mistake or conflict, something like that?
I think it was I can't remember if it was a colleague in difficulty or having witnessed a mistake.
Yes, I think
It
it
was,
was, if you see a colleague making a mistake, how do you deal?
and there was, in all of the prep bits that I'd done, there's a standard answer sheet. I think it's SPIES. It's and going through more or less a kind of scripted performer. And again, that felt like a step back to a comfort question. It was making sure you just went through that acronym, you hit all the points, and then you were happy afterwards. And so that was comfortable. And then the non-exec asked a not dissimilar question, and I more or less repeated the answer but with the phrasing and the scenario that he had presented. But again, it was I think a colleague in difficulty or a trouble or along those lines.
So in answering not all questions, but some of the questions, did you end up using, the acronyms that we get given when you go to an interview course? You get given the STAR acronym and all the rest of it. Do you think they were useful, or do you think they just bring your answer down to the level of the bare minimum that's needed to touch upon all the points? I mean, can you demonstrate a bit of oomph with that structure is what my question is
I think
basically.
I think definitely for the colleague in difficulty or witnessing a mistake, I think that was the perfect use for those structures, because it meant you could fall back on something and you were going to hit the points that the interview panel were expecting to hear. I don't think those questions really give scope for an oomph answer to them. You don't want someone to be stepping out and trying to make a show of necessarily an answer to that question. I may be wrong, but you want someone to appear calm, competent, and confident in how they would go about addressing those questions. And I think the acronym or the fallback of having that framework definitely helped. For the broader questions, the camp structure, the clinical academic publications and kind of personal, that helped in formulating my answer initially in the preparation phase. And I think that definitely helped in answering those first slightly more open, long-winded questions in terms of my
So do you
answer. But
think something like,
I don't think I had it in my head when I was answering the question. I had it in my head when I was writing the answer and then was practicing with my wife.
so something like camp, do you think that might have helped you answer the other tricky questions? So for example, the service development question, or the one that I asked on reflecting on your things. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm
No,
just thinking of
I
what
think
your
more of
opinion is about
those
that.
were, they weren't curveball, but they weren't necessarily standard questions. I think I would have fallen back onto those. They required, I don't think the service development question, maybe your question, I could have fallen back on a bit more of a camp structure to it, just to hit some of those kind of clinical or academic. And I could have gone through each of those and say how they had changed for the better or worse, and showed some reflection that was falling across your whole spectrum of personality. But I think that would have felt a bit more forced. I think given myself the time to answer, I think it probably came across as a bit more natural to answer in the way that I did. And
Yeah.
I think if you're selling yourself as a clinician to, or as a colleague to the panel, you want to come across a little bit more human rather than a stock answer.
How many in your preparation, how many stories, examples, etc.? Did you like have a bank of them, or did you just have two or three that you would fit around? How many did
I
you
think I
prepare
probably had about
before?
8 or so that could fit a few different scenarios, and some of those had degrees of interchangeability about them. There was a few more long-winded, kind of talk me through your CV, talk me through your experience in vascular, and then I had a few mistakes, a few research type bits, a few audit type bits, and some stories that could, with a degree of fudging, and be fit into different scenarios. And even though those didn't come up, I think the habit of talking through them was helpful.
How difficult do you think? How difficult did you find the interview?
I found managing my own nerves probably the biggest part. And then I don't know how it always comes across. I think it come across as being a bit nervous, but I
Would you
think it
do
was,
anything?
sorry.
Go on.
No, I think when I made a joke to you actually, it was my legs had literally cramped up for about 48 hours after the interview, because I was so concentrating on having an outward projection of calm, and that I was tensing up my calves like nobody's business under the table, and almost fell over as I got up to leave the interview room.
Yeah, no, you managed the projection quite well. In terms of the nerves that you faced during the interview, would you do something different, or what advice would you give others coming up to interviews
I think
about how nervous should they be, and what could they do? I mean, did you use anything in particular to reduce your nerves? Because as you said yourself, because of your nerves, there was a lot of things that you could have said that they didn't necessarily come out because you were that nervous. Any tips or advice on that?
Think if I hadn't been nervous, you could have come across as blasé and overconfident, which I think has its own negatives to it. I think nerves are good and they're healthy. They show that you care about the thing that you're going for, and having no nerves at all is probably a bad sign. Knowing a little bit, like with Vivas, the people on the panel are there to not to try to find flaws. They're trying to ask the questions of you to find you appointable, not the other way around. They're not trying to find you unappointable. And that, I think I would have hammered that message into my head a little bit harder, thinking that these people are more on your side than against you. And it's hard not to feel that kind of slightly confrontational feeling when you're sitting at a panel in front of a lot of people. Definitely, it's at the end of the interview, it felt both fair and friendly, and that everyone had been approachable and not the poker face necessarily that you get presented in a Viva scenario. Receptive.
Yeah.
And then the preparation beforehand, I think it's I didn't spend the whole night before kind of poring over answers and watched a movie. I think I prepared up until about 7 o'clock, had dinner, watched a movie, and had a whiskey. And that seemed like the better way to prepare. But I think that's having come through kind of a few kind of exams and everything else. It's I've seen that me cramming until 1 a.m. is not helpful for anyone.
No. So did you do any, just talking about your preparation for the interview, did you do any interview courses, or did you do anything like that? What did you do in terms of the so-called interview prep?
The interview prep I did purely by myself. I had plans to do a one-to-one coaching with another interview preparation course, but never, when I did get round to booking it, it had been very booked out, and so there was no scope available. I used the resources that I had from a colleague who had the ICS course book, and had said that he felt that for him the group ICS course wasn't as beneficial as just the PDF and the preparation that he did. I think so I spent a lot of time reading through the ICS book. I spent some time trawling through the various Reddit groups of different people with different questions and advice. I then spent a bit of time going through the various reports and utilizing a bit of AI. So I used Gemini to summarize all of the board and AGM meetings, as it can analyze YouTube videos and then can give you a tailored summary. Then
the board and AGM stuff never actually came up, did it?
It never came up. Shoehorned something in about it. I remember I put kind of one line in, but I think it highlighted some of the bits specific to East and North Arts about the Kaizen methodology and the
yes.
So I put that in because it had come up a few times, and the medical director had mentioned it as well in his pre-interview meeting. So I knew that it was an important buzzword well, not buzzword, but it was something that was topical that was going to be good to mention in the meeting.
Interesting you mentioned Reddit. I didn't know there was a whole thing on Reddit about this. So
yeah,
was that useful?
I'm not really entirely sure anything on Reddit's useful. It's I'd say if you're happy, then usually you don't go to the internet to post about it. It's most people post on horror stories. So if anything, I would, with everything, take anything on a forum with a pinch of salt. People only put horror stories, but it gives a useful, I think with anything, you learn from other people's mistakes. And then it was practicing out loud. So I spent quite a while formulating what I thought likely questions were going to be. And some colleagues who had been through the process had given questions that they had been asked, as well as some of their preparation that they had done. And so I had a fairly sizable bank of questions that I then spent a decent amount of time on a Word document with formulating out some answers, then sticking them into Gemini, kind of coming up with some things that it thought that you could either highlight. So kind of I built on Gemini, I'm not sure what the equivalent is on ChatGPT, but a gem that went along with it. So I put in my CV, my experience, my one of the ICS PDFs, and said, based on this, give me some answers relevant to an anesthetic consultant interview using all of the information that you've got from those uploads. And then went through kind of giving answers and tailored them along that. And that was more just getting some stories, getting some structure, and then spent 2 weeks, most evenings, boring my wife and going through those kind of stocks of questions. And I think initially I kept on trying to recite stories, which came out jolted and terrible. And it was only once you kind of got a bit more comfortable with a base structure, you could then talk around them. And it was almost like kind of hitting the key points that you knew you had in the structure, and the way that you talked around them, the words that you used were interchangeable.
So the number of things you mentioned, which were very interesting. The first was they kind of go with each other. The first thing you said was that most of the things you read weren't useful, which makes sense because you mentioned about Reddit and the PDFs and the AGM's minutes and stuff like that, which I kind of agree. Yeah, they might not be that useful. What I think you're trying to say was very useful was actually practicing with your wife, which helped you make structures of answers and speak out loud. And also very encouragingly for others doing this is the fact that initially when you first start off doing that, you just hear yourself talk utter gibberish and you think, I am so bad at it. But it's only with regular practice that you start to see the improvement. And would you say that was the most helpful part of it, just practicing it every day?
Sing every day, and then not trying to rote memorize stock answers. I think those were the biggest takeaways. And I think you can only get to that point just by practicing and saying it out loud. And I said it out loud to myself, to a video, to PowerPoint, which has a little way of recording yourself to make sure your cadence and your tone varies. And then,
did you watch yourself back then?
I didn't watch myself back. I didn't have the guts to do that, but it's I listened to it back.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Even that's pretty good. If you listen to yourself back, that's quite good. You can actually, I don't know if you know, you can practice speaking with ChatGPT these days. It's got a conversation mode, so you can have a whole conversation back and forth with ChatGPT, like it was another person. So, and that's another thing that's useful. Great. Any final tips or advice for candidates who are where you were a few months ago?
No, I think it's not throwing. I think I felt like I had to throw a lot more money at the process than I ended up doing, mainly due to my own inaptitude of booking things. But it's the practicing out loud was the most useful thing. I think you could probably finesse some things if you did it with a coach, and it depends on kind of your comfort with those bits. But I think the practicing was infinitely the most useful bit. So it meant that you were comfortable saying everything you had out loud to someone else and not feeling forced. It's not the most natural thing to come and sell yourself. And so after you've said it for the 15th, 20th time to whoever you're practicing with, when you're then saying it for the first time to a room of strangers, it doesn't feel as artificial.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, Ed, for your time, and hope to see you around at work.
Sure you will.